Welcome back. Welcome back to my series on teaching beginners. This is video number 2 in the series, and this video is all about how to present and teach vocab to a beginner student. If you missed video number 1, it's worthwhile to take a look at it because the content's pretty good. But if you don't want to watch that video, if you just want to learn how to present and teach vocab, you can jump in right here without any problems. Let's get into it. Oh, and my name is Chris Westergaard from the Language House, and I run one of the most successful and popular on-site TOEFL certification courses in the world. If you're interested in teaching abroad, if you want to move to a foreign country, do check us out. Our course, it's not just about training to be a good English teacher, it's also about the community, finding an apartment, getting a job. We handle all of those things, so do check us out if you're interested. And teachers, as always, if you like this content, if you like what I'm doing, hit the subscribe button. I'm here on a Saturday. My wife, she's waiting at home for me. I'm here alone at the school making this content. I like doing it for you, but it helps a lot if you can give me a like and a subscribe, maybe even a comment or something like that. Or don't do it, I can't tell you what to do. The goal of this beginner series is to teach you an effective method for this level that I created called the 5 points. We're gonna be delving deep into that structure in video number 3, but this video is all about how to present and teach vocab. It makes sense to start here so we can reference this content in the next video. Whether you're teaching lexis or really anything like grammar or pronunciation, it's going to be similar teaching beginners to any other level, but at the same time, there's still some very concrete and powerful differences, and it's important to go over this stuff. Tip number 1, make sure what you're teaching is level appropriate, it's useful, and that it comes up in the rest of the lesson. One of the biggest mistakes that teachers make when they're teaching beginners is they'll teach one kind of category of language. So for example, animals or personality types. And what happens is yeah, the students might learn a bunch of adjectives or they might learn a bunch of nouns for animals, but they don't know how to use the actual language. What you need to do instead is really think, what are my students going to be doing at the end of class? What questions are they going to be asking, and how are they going to be answering those questions? From there, I'll be able to look at all of the language that might come up, the verbs, the nouns, the adjectives, and I want to teach those. Don't just teach a bunch of topical language. We're going to be talking about this a lot more in video number 3, but it's such an important fundamental that it makes sense to bring it up now. Tip number 2, organize your vocab in their correct parts of speech. It can be really confusing for students if you're teaching a verb and then you switch to an adjective and then you go to a noun and then you go to an adverb. It's not going to work. It gets really confusing. It's a lot easier for your students to digest if they know that these are the verbs, these are nouns, and these are adjectives. So tip number 2 is to group all that language up. Aside from that, it's good to color code these when you write them on the board. So get a variety of different colored markers. All of your verbs can be red, all of your nouns can be blue, all of your adjectives can be black, etc. It makes it a lot clearer. Tip number 4, when boarding your vocab, make sure to identify the part of speech. So all of my verbs are going to be the infinitive form. All of my adjectives are going to have ADJ by them. All of my nouns are going to have an article. If it's an uncountable noun, I'll put an N by it. These things are important because you want it to be where your students look at a word and they can identify what part of speech it is. It makes the meaning a lot clearer. If I board a word and the students don't know what part of speech it is, the meaning becomes really difficult to kind of suss out, even if your elicit is good. So do this little tip, it'll save you a ton of time. Tip number 5, aside from teaching words by grouping them in their different parts of speech, it also helps you to think of a logical order in how to teach these words. So one of the easiest ways is doing opposites. If I'm teaching the word rich, it makes sense to teach the word poor afterwards. If I'm teaching the word strong, it makes sense to teach the word weak. By doing the opposites, that meaning comes across a lot easier. So look at your words and what you're doing and try to think like, is there a logical progression for these words? It will make your eliciting, which we'll be talking about later on, a lot easier. All right, last tip. In terms of actual teaching, I want to teach beginners like any other level, meaning that I'm going to elicit the meaning and hopefully the actual word from them. The trick with beginner students is that they don't have the language pool that your B1 or your B2 or even your A2 students have. So you're going to really have to stick with nonverbal elicits. And these are going to be miming, drawing, pictures, realia, props. You're literally gonna have to show them what the thing is rather than describe what the word is, because all of that extra language using definitions or context, it's just gonna confuse them because they don't have the language to understand what you're trying to do. You got all those tips? Let's head over to the board over here and we can actually teach some of these words. Okay, so here are the full steps. I'm gonna start with my elicit, and I'm just going to show them what it is. Now in this case, I'm using realia, so it makes the whole process easier, but I'm not gonna say anything. I'm not gonna start by saying I'm gonna teach you a bunch of new words related to clothing or whatever it is. I'm just going to show them the elicit. And what I'm gonna try to do is get them, or get one of the students to yell out the word jacket. And if they can do that, great, I'll put it up on the board. But if not, I'll begin to trail this out. So that's gonna look something like a jacket, just like that. Obviously, if you have realia, it makes the whole process easier, but you might not. So in that case, you can have pictures, you can draw, you can mime, you can do a lot of these visual cues to get that word across. Just try not to use a lot of language when you're doing so. In fact, if you can use zero language, that's probably the best. So I got the word up on the board. I've got the article with the word. Great. All of my nouns are going to be black, so I'll keep that consistent. Now the next step is that we need to drill/choral this word. And that means I'll say it, and then the students will say it back to me. And we're gonna do this about 8 times. It seems really redundant to do it that much and kind of like beating a dead horse. Our students, they don't have the experience with the language, and it's really helpful for them to say the word over and over. So what this looks like is I'll say a jacket, and the students will say a jacket, and then I'll say a jacket, and the students will say a jacket, and then I'll get half the class to say it, and then the other half to say it. And we'll do this about 8 times. And it's important to not skip this step because it's really the only time that students are going to have pronouncing this word for the first time. And if they don't feel comfortable with the pronunciation of the word and making the sounds, you're not going to get them to speak later on in the lesson. Also, I'm not just passively going through this process. I'm actively listening for pronunciational mistakes, and I'm going to jump in and try to correct those in real time. I'm going to put about 3 of my words up there, and then it's important to CCQ. CCQing means concept check questioning, and it's a way of checking our students' comprehension of a concept without asking, do you understand? Because asking, do you understand is pointless. I've got a video on that right here if you want to check it out. Now, with beginners, you can't ask them the same types of CCQs that you would your B1 or upper level students. You can't ask things like, when would you wear a jacket, or why would you want to wear a jacket? You have to do really basic CCQs. And one of the easiest ways is just give them a false statement. So I might say, jacket, and the students will go, no. And then I'll say, jacket, and they'll go, yes. That's it at this level. It's really basic. At the end of the presentation, my board should look something like this, with all of the words categorized in their right parts of speech and color coordinated. And I'm going to end the presentation part with a little rapid fire check. So I will, hold up the word and they'll shout it out. And this is just, a final check to make sure that they have it all down before we move into the studies. And that's it. It's really super easy if you just follow those steps. Before we leave, I want to give you a few pieces of advice to wrap this whole thing up. Piece of advice number 1, I've talked about it. Try to do this without speaking at all. Really make an effort to not talk to your beginner students, even if it feels awkward. Have your elicits do all of the work for you. So have your pictures do the work for you, your realia, all of these things should enable you to teach these concepts without speaking. If you talk to your beginners like a regular class, they're going to get confused and you're going to lose them. Piece of advice number 2 is to drill this content a lot. Do your chorals and your drilling as we talked about. Spend a fair amount of time here really getting these concepts down before moving into the next part. And lastly, slow everything down. The biggest complaint that beginner students say when they're working with a native English speaker or if a teacher is not using translation is that it's just too much information, and it makes sense. Beginners can't absorb new material like your B1 students or your B2 students, so you're gonna have to really kind of slow things down a little bit and let that material absorb. Thanks so much for watching. Stick around for video number 3. I'm gonna teach you this great system called the 5 points. We're gonna go from here, teaching words, to being able to have your students communicate in real time. So stay tuned.